this is Marika, and welcome back to another session with me. So, as we are dealing the fifth unit, we have discussed what is education, right? We have seen the different aims of education, we've seen different principles of education, and we also discussed about the philosophies of education, right? So, in our today's session, we are going to learn about teaching. Last session, we discussed about learning, and we've seen that how teaching and learning is a twin activity, right? Without the process of teaching, there is no learning activities carried out, and also without the process of learning or a concept of learning, teaching cannot take place, right? So they are both essential for the existence of each other. So today we are going to see teaching and principles of teaching. Now, when we talk about teaching, what is teaching? It is a familiar word. We know, we think that teaching is coming and giving out knowledge on a certain topic, right? Today, we are going to discuss what exactly teaching is and what are the principles that are the foundation of teaching process as a teacher, or what should a teacher follow while the teacher is taking class. All right. Now, transferring and imparting knowledge is teaching, right? So, transferring and imparting knowledge to people is equally important as generating the knowledge, right? People can generate knowledge, but if that knowledge is not transferred, if it is not imparted to the people, it is of no use, right? Transferring and imparting knowledge is also equally important. Now, when knowledge is transferred to people in the right way, right, in a proper way, if the knowledge is transferred, it will help the students, the learners to retain what is taught in the class, right? So, if it is taught in a well planned manner, the students will be able to retain or will be able to remember what was taught. Also, it becomes easier for the students to recall what was taught whenever it is necessary, right? So whatever we have learned, we need to recall those things, right? For example, during our examinations in the past 1 year must be recollected. We must recall what we have learned during the period of 1 year and write during our examination, right? So when a knowledge is transferred to another person in the right way, in a proper way, the learning process is simplified, and also it helps the student to retain what was taught to them, and it will also help them for easy recollection of the lessons that were learned. All right. So what is teaching? Teaching is a process of transferring and imparting knowledge about any subject matter, right? When you talk about anything, when you have a knowledge about any subject or any content, and if you transfer that knowledge to another individual, that is known as teaching. Now, fruitful teaching or fruitful transfer of knowledge can be done by using various student friendly teaching learning methods. All right, those method that is understood and that makes it easier for the students to understand the topic taught must be chosen for a teaching learning process. All right, it results in fruitful transfer of knowledge from the educator to the learner. Now let's talk about teaching nursing. Nursing is an art and science. It is not just about studying theoretically, it is about carrying out practically, right? Carrying out the various activities and procedures practically. So teaching nursing also involves effective application of various methods of teaching and learning, right? So to teach learning also, it is because we know it is not just theoretical, it is also practical. Skills has to be demonstrated, right? How to carry out a procedure must be demonstrated to the student, right? It is not just about reading it out, but it is also about demonstrating it to the students, teaching it in an appropriate way, right? So to teach nursing also involves using of various methods of teaching and learning process. All right. Now we must understand that teaching is an art as well as science. Now obviously teaching is considered as an art, right? But why is teaching also considered as science? Teaching is science because teaching is carried out, it is planned and organized It is carried out according to a set of knowledge and principles. Teaching is based on systematic body and principles. That is why it is also a science. Alright, so I hope you have understood what teaching is, right? Let us now discuss the different principles of teaching. Now, principles of teaching will help a teacher to understand about their strength and their weakness. Alright? Also, principle will provide information pertaining to teaching, like whom should the teacher teach, why to teach those selected people, where to teach them, how to teach them, and when to teach them. It provides an insight to the teacher about his weakness and his strength. All right. It also provides information pertaining to teaching, like how to teach, where should I teach, whom should I teach, and why should I teach those particular student. All right. Now, there are various principles under principles of teaching. We will discuss one by one each of the principles. So the first principle is principle of motivation. Now, as believed, the best teacher is the one who inspires the student, who motivates the students. So it is believed that human mind is like a parachute. It works only when it is open, right? So through the process of teaching, it is the teacher who unleash or who opens the talents of the student by motivating them. All right. So the teacher has to motivate the students to learn something. In order to teach, the teacher must have that capability to motivate the students to learn about the thing that is being taught. All right. Now, motivation is the combination of recognizing, communicating, and participating. Now, what is recognizing, communicating, and participating means? So here, when the teacher is trying to motivate the student, the teacher must recognize the student as an individual, differ in their capabilities, right? They have different interests as a unique individual, all right? So that is recognizing, right? Now, the next role of the teacher is to encourage the participation of the students. As I said, motivation is a combination of recognizing, participating, and communicating. All right. So the teacher must ensure the participation of the students into the teaching learning process. And finally, communication. So the teacher must communicate enthusiasm. The teacher must be able to inculcate that motivation and enthusiasm within the students so that they participate in the teaching learning process, so that they learn. So motivation will promote active learning in the students, and hence it will enable the students to achieve their goals in a systematic way. So the first principle is principle of motivation, which says that the best teacher is the one who is able to motivate the student, the teacher who is able to inspire the students. So the teacher has to recognize the student as an individual student, right? They must respect the individual differences. The teacher must encourage the participation of the student. And finally, the teacher must be able to communicate enthusiasm among all the students. Because motivation promotes active learning, and hence the student will be able to achieve goals systematically if they are motivated. All right. Next one, we have principles of activity. Now, teaching is basically an active process, right? There are people who are actively involved in the process of teaching. While the teacher is teaching, the teacher must be alert, the teacher must be smart, and the teacher must follow the most suitable method for teaching. Now, teaching is effective only when students participate in the process of teaching. So, active participation of the student is required and is necessary for the teaching process. Learning becomes more active and quicker if the students are involved physically and mentally. Right? If the students are involved in the process, learning becomes quick. The student will be able to retain what they have learned as well, right? So the teacher should participate along with the students in various group activities such as conducting research, or carrying out certain projects and assignments. All right. So providing various assignments and projects to the student, involving with the student and carrying out those projects and assignment will not only help the teacher to be involved with the student or to maintain a good rapport with the student, but it will also enhance the creative skills of the students. Now, when I talk about nursing education, a nurse educator who is actively involved in the clinical practice of the student will obviously help the student to become more efficient in their clinical practice rather than a nurse educator who is just providing a theory class, right? Because nursing is one such profession which requires equal amount of theoretical and practical knowledge. So a nursing educator who is equally involved in the clinical practice of the student and not just in theoretical classes helps the student to be competent enough in honing their skills. So the second principle is principle of activity. It says that students must be cut. Students must be actively involved in the process of teaching, right? Students and the teacher must carry out various tasks together so that it will also enhance the creative skills of the student and help the teacher maintain a good relation with all the students, right? Getting involved in an activity is also beneficial for the students because it makes learning easier, it makes learning quicker, as well as it makes the retention of. Moving on, we have third principle, that is arouse interest in the students. Even though teaching is considered as imparting knowledge or transfer of knowledge from the teacher to the students, the teacher should be able to elicit the interest in the students. Now, how can a teacher elicit interest among the students? The teacher can help arouse interest in the student by telling a story, an inspirational story, or asking question to the student, right? Or by citing an example. All right. So it is the teacher who has to make sure that the students are interested in the particular topic. If the students are not interested, the process of teaching is of no use, right? So the teacher has to make sure that the students have the interest or they develop the interest towards the topic before taking the topic. So the teacher can tell an inspirational story, or the teacher can cite an example of somebody or someone who can inculcate interest within the students, or the teacher can ask questions to the students about the topic so that they would want to learn about the particular topic. The fourth principle is well-defined objective. Now we know what is an objective. A well-defined objective or a predetermined objective is a set of goal or a set of objective given to fulfill. All right. You work towards attaining that predetermined goal or predetermined objective, right? Now to attain good results in teaching, all the teaching process must be carried out towards achieving a predetermined goal or predetermined objective, which means for the teaching process to carry out, you need to have objective in mind. Now, with an objective in mind, it is easier to deal with the subject. It is easier to select the AV8s for the process of teaching. It is easier to select the method of teaching, and it also becomes easier to evaluate the sessions that has been taken. So for any teaching process to carry out smoothly, we need to have a predetermined objective. According to that objective, we have to plan our teaching session. All right. So once it is pre-planned and once there's a goal to be attained, it becomes easier to carry out the process. Next, we have principle of individual differences. So this is something we have been speaking and discussing from the very first unit, right? Every individual differs in each and everything, their capacity, their interest, their capabilities, their way of perception, their judgmental abilities, their decision making, and each and everything, right? Now, a good teacher always respects the individual difference of the students. There can be differences in each and every student, and as a good teacher, the teacher must respect the individual differences, their judgmental abilities, and everything. The teacher must view a student as a unique individual. Now, why is it necessary for the teacher to understand individual differences or to view each and every student as an individual or a unique individual? Because viewing a particular student as a unique individual will help the teacher to understand the strength and weakness of the student. If we categorize every student as one, or if we do not see the individual differences as a teacher among the student, we cannot understand the strength and weaknesses of the students. But by differentiating the individual according to the differences that they have, it becomes easier for the teacher to understand student individually, and the teacher can develop strategies to cater the educational need of individual students. All right. Next one, we have principle of creativity. Now, by applying creativity or by using creativity, the teacher can make a boring teaching learning process an active process. If the session is creative, if the teacher is able to make the class creative, it will also activate the motivation in the students to get involved in the class or to get involved in the teaching learning process. Now, usually when we take an example of classroom, a classroom is usually teacher centered, which means the teacher comes and speaks about a topic, delivers the lecture. The students are not active, the students are passive. The teacher can motivate the students, right? Because of which the students will participate in the teaching learning process, and it will convert a teacher-centered classroom into student-centered classroom. So we are carrying out the teaching activity in order to make sure that the students learn, right? So a classroom should actually be student-centered, but usually we see it is teacher-centered, right? The students are passive, listening to what the teacher is speaking. But through creativity, a classroom can be made into student-centered classroom. All right. Next, we have principle of selection. Now, from the term itself, we can understand what it is, right? The teacher must select everything that is being used in the teaching process properly, right? Proper selection of the content that is going to be delivered, the method of teaching that is to be used by the teacher, media of instruction, AV aids, the textbooks, the journals, articles, everything that is involved during the teaching process, the teacher must select it properly. All right. By selecting proper textbooks, by selecting proper media, right, by selecting proper AV aids, by selecting proper method of teaching, the teacher will be able to make the learning process simplified, and it will be easily understood by the students. All right. Next, we have principle of division. Now, teaching should have a definite division, right? So what does division mean? To divide it into different parts, right? Now the teacher must be aware about the division of the content that is being taught to the student, and the teacher must present the content in a well organized manner. All right, so principle of division says that the teacher must divide the content appropriately and must deliver the content in an organized manner. Let us see an example for this. Now, in a single session, a disease condition, the causes, and the management of the disease condition cannot be taught, right? It takes various sessions for the teacher to complete one disease condition, right? Now, it is the responsibility of the teacher to divide the content in a well organized manner and deliver the lecture accordingly. Like, as I said, if the teacher is taking a disease condition, the teacher must divide. For the first session, the teacher will be taking introduction, definition, causes, and risk factor. Right? Now, once this is done, in the next session, the teacher must teach about signs and symptoms, diagnosis, and management. Now, because a particular topic sometimes cannot be completed in one particular session, there must be divisions made, right? So those divisions that a teacher make must be done appropriately. It must be divided accordingly, and it must be delivered in a manner that is organized, right? This avoids confusion among the students, and it also helps the teacher to teach in a better way. All right. Next, we have principle of revision and practice. During the session of teaching, it is required for the teacher to do revisions in between and towards the end of the class. Revising or summarizing the topic by the end of the session or by the end of the class is called as recapitalization. Now, as we are discussing the principle of revision as well as practice along with recapitulation, the teacher has to motivate the students to practice the learned lessons periodically to enhance their knowledge and for easy recollection. All right. This principle says that it is the responsibility of the teacher to make sure that the content is revised by the end of the session or by the end of the class, which is called as recapitulation. It is also the responsibility of the teacher to make sure that the teacher motivates the students to periodically practice what is learned. All right. Next, we have principles of correlation. Now, the function of teaching is to impart knowledge, right? To understand and teach certain skills. So, while the teaching process, the teacher must make sure that the teacher correlates the topic as far as possible, so that whatever knowledge was transferred to the student earlier must not remain segregated. Right? For the knowledge that was transferred to not remain segregated, the teacher must try to correlate the topics, must try to correlate the content that is being taught. Now, life and learning and teaching process are interdependent and they cannot exist without one another. All right. Now, especially when we talk about nursing, correlation is very helpful in nursing education, because to render a comprehensive nursing care, one has to correlate different branches of knowledge, right? Different aspects of knowledge. It is not just about what you have learned in nursing field, what you have learned practically, right? You have to put your sympathy, empathy while dealing with the patient, while rendering the care to the patient, right? You have to also apply your psychological knowledge, right? To understand the development of the patient, to correlate different branches of knowledge to provide comprehensive nursing care. Next one is connecting with life. Now, this is again similar to the correlation of knowledge, right? Now, there is a relationship between life and teaching, right? Teaching is integral part of our life, right? And all the activities that we carry out in our life is somehow related to what we have learned or what is taught to us, right? So whatever is being taught to the student must be connected to real life, right? What we've discussed in the last principle. So for example, when we are talking about a disease condition, suppose we are talking about disorders of kidney, before we jump on to the disorder, we teach about anatomy and physiology of the particular system, right? That is because the students will be able to relate, the students will be able to understand the particular anatomy and physiology. Later on, it becomes easier for the students to understand the disease condition, right? We have to correlate teaching with life and we have to teach to the students, all right? Next, we have principle of planning. The success of teaching learning process largely depends on the planning, right? For any process to carry out properly, we need proper planning. So successful teaching is always well planned, right? Now, planning involves selection, division, and revision. Now, as discussed, what is selection? Selecting the appropriate content, selecting the appropriate AVA, selecting the appropriate method of teaching. Next, we have division. As discussed, division is dividing the content and teaching to the student in a well-organized manner, right? And lastly, we have revision under planning, which means practice of assimilated knowledge. So, revision will help the teacher to understand the effectiveness of the class as well, right? So, a good teaching must always be well planned. From the way the content is selected to divided and how it is revised, everything must be well planned. All right. Next one, we have principle of pupil centered. As I said, generally in a classroom, we see that a classroom is teacher centered. The teacher is the active person speaking all the time, delivering the lecture, whereas the students are just listening and are passive in the process, right? But the teaching process should be student centered or pupil centered. The need of the student, the interest of the student, the ability of the students, and the aspiration of the students must be given due importance to during the process of teaching. Next one, we have principle of progressiveness. Now, from the term itself, it is understandable what does this principle means, right? Teaching must focus on the progress. Teaching must focus on the overall progress and development of the children, of the students. Now, good teaching, it strives for progress in skills, their attitudes, interest of the student in their personal as well as professional life. So, good teaching must always focus on progress of the student, not just in their professional life, but also in their personal life. It must focus on the overall development of the students. And finally, we have principles of liberating mind, right? So, what does this principle say? Ideal teaching must help the child to liberate from any kind of fear if it exists. Okay, so if the student have any kind of fear, the teaching must help the student liberate from that fear. The student must be free of fear. All right, and it also must focus on independence of the students so that the students are able to carry out their own activities and make their own decisions and solve their own problems in life. So these are the various principles of teaching. So to conclude, today we've seen what is teaching and what are the various principles involved in the process of teaching, right? I hope the class was helpful and I'll see you all in the next session. Thank you and have a great day.